I went to undergraduate at a school called Norfolk State University. I went there on a wrestling scholarship back in the 80s, a long time ago. Got my master's in software engineering from Central Michigan University later on, as I partook in my career. I'm going to talk a little about my career because it really drives how I came to sort of my frame of thought on security and how I think security should be managed. So from 1988 to 1987, 97 rather, I spent I started off my career as a programmer doing Pascal programming. So any of you guys who are a little older or my age bracket, as old as I am, probably know that I was working on a defense contract doing a conversion of a Wang basic program into Turbo Pascal. And, and the security around that was, it was a physical box and they had physical security around that. Really, security wasn't part of that conversation back in those days. That project lasted about 9 months, and then I got had an opportunity to start to move to a program called a contract we had won called Modern Aids to Program Planning, which was a government contract for the Department of Defense to do modeling and simulation for the government. It was the early days of the big CPX exercise program. So the Joint Staff spent a lot of money and funded all these different simulation models, and every major command got a set of VAX equipment, the old 8650s and mini VAXs, and the whole series of equipment. Used to take a whole room to hold that equipment in storage to run these simulation models. So I was a developer in that program for a number of years. I ended up in Panama during Just Cause, and we did the simulation of that whole Just Cause scenario in one of the simulations that we supported. Ended up leaving, stayed with that contract for about 10 years through different companies. The contract got passed on from Booz Allen to CSC. I spent 3 years in Korea and Japan doing the same kind of thing, JTEL, CBS, core battle simulation. The big CPX exercise, you always hear the North Koreans asking for us to pause the ultra-focus lens is the name of that one exercise. I used to run that program from out of the Korean Battle Sim Center in Seoul for a number of years. So that was the first part of my career. And obviously, I got introduced to security when I was at Southcom. I got handed an AR 380 manual and said, hey, we need to do accreditation for all of our equipment. And that was my first introduction. It was really a paper drill that didn't do anything from a security perspective. It was really answering questions in an Army reg. I'll show you a little bit about that in a second. Second part of my career, I ended up leaving, when Southcom relocated to Miami, I ended up moving back to DC, took a job with Institute for Defense Analysis. It's Institute for Defense Analysis is a think tank for the Joint Staff and NSA. So I got really deep into security during my tenure there. So I started off as running a networking team, and back in those days, security was networking responsibility. So all network engineers, you were a network engineer and you also had security, you were the security lead hat, right? So we dealt with the Melissa, I Love You, and all those type of viruses. And then at the same time, as things started to progress, I got introduced to the ATP, and that was when I worked with the NSA. So we had a contract with the NSA, we supported them, and at this time, it was all highly classified. I had a TS, SCI clearance just to go and talk to these guys about the threats that were out there. So we were monitoring those threats in the early days in the mid-2000s, right? And so I had a kind of an awareness of how bad that problem was. We had, imagine at a think tank like IDA, we had a lot of research and researchers that were there that had intellectual capital that was of interest to obviously that particular group, right? And so we had one incident where the brother of one of our employees, who was a specialist in Chinese, in a Chinese theater, he was hacked. His brother's system were hacked at home to get to the guy inside of our environment. So went through, and those were some of the early targeted attacks that we started seeing back in the early days. So I left IDA after 10 years there, became the IT director here for the last 4 years, and then I went to a company called Kennametal. Bad career move, I'll just skip over that. Everybody's had one of those. It lasted a year, and then I was out of there. It was like, hey, I can't deal with this. I ended up moving and ended up back at another think tank, Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. So interesting story about Johns Hopkins. When I first got there, this is a university, so their philosophy was, hey, we want to treat the culture, the environment like a university. We don't want to have Big Brother watching over everybody. But a lot of interesting research went on at APL. A lot of smart people there. Some of you folks here may know some of the relationships with MDA and the relationship with Huntsville and Johns Hopkins. A lot of interesting things happened. This was in late 2000, 2007 timeframe. So I got there, and my job was to lead up, be the first sort of information security officer there, and kind of lead up the transformation that was going to go on there with security. Had conversations with lots of folks in the organization. They didn't understand why I wanted to look at things the way I wanted to look at it. And I knew, after my experience at IDA, that the ATP was there already. I just needed to prove it to everybody else in the organization. And it took me about almost 9 months to get to that point where it actually proved that they were there, right? Because they had been dealing with security. They had a very sophisticated set of tools and capabilities from a forensics perspective, but it was all siloed. No communication across the different groups. IT and security were sort of disjointed organizations, and so it took a lot of cultural adjustment to really get to the point. And actually, they didn't come to the realization until the Navy came to us one day and said, hey, we want to put one of our sensors on your network. And early on, when I first got there, I wanted to bring in a company called Mandiant, who's now bought by FireEye, to bring in one of their sensors to kind of monitor our environment. I said, hey, I couldn't get anybody to buy into that. They're like, hey, no, we're not ready for that. We don't really need that. It's overkill. So then Navy comes in and says, hey, we're going to put our sensor on your network. So people got everybody's attention. So I use that as a way to convince the organization to say, hey, before the Navy comes in here and finds a bunch of things that I know are here that you guys were arguing about, let's bring Mandiant back in and have them take a look at our environment. They were there for not even a day, probably like a half a day. Tripped right after the first system they looked at, picked up the signature of the ATP. We ended up, and this was the beginning of this whole thought pattern, and I go the credit to Dr. Roca, who was the head of the lab at the time. His position was he was going to be transparent about the whole thing. He said, we're going to call everybody, we're going to tell everybody, we're going to make this announcement, we're going to end this sort of secrecy around the fact that everybody's compromised. And everybody now, the new mantra is, you're compromised, just a matter of when, right? And that's even Dr. Ross at NIST started using that theme back in 2008 timeframe as a result of some of these things that happened. So we went off on a campaign. We notified all our sponsors. The lab, just to give you an idea of the size of the lab, 7,000 employees there, lots of programs, lots of government sponsors. So we went on a campaign. I had one of the tasks of reaching out to all of our sponsors to give them the bad news. And I thought it was going to be bad news, but it was a welcome call from their perspective. It says it's about time people start being transparent about this and start talking, because the only way we're going to defeat these kinds of threats is if we share the fact that we're compromised and share that data. So we went through this whole series of, we basically shut the lab down for about 2 weeks, took everything out, and then basically brought everything back in clean. And we'll get into some of more of the stuff later. So just a little bit of background from my perspective. All right, so I left Hopkins and ended up with a commercial company called Ironbow Technologies. We did services. I was the head of CIO and ran a managed service group for a little commercial experience. Still had similar security challenges. I think I just turned this mic off? Huh? Okay. Yeah, so I took some of the, obviously, the lessons learned, and there are some key things that work, right? From a security perspective, you learn over the course of your career, and you say, hey, wherever I go, I'm going to do this. I'm a big believer in application whitelisting. I think that is a key tool that you need to have in your tool set, because the Windows platform is the major attack vector, still is. The Mac is creeping up. Linux obviously has a big foothold, but the Windows platform is still a major attack vector, and I'm a big believer in applications. So everywhere I go, I make sure that if they don't have an application whitelisting capability, we're going to put something in place, because that gives me comfort to know that I can see my entire footprint. Another big key is this whole issue around understanding and having visibility into all your assets, right? And we'll get into that a little bit deeper. So Ironbow, 8 years there, we did some consulting on the services. Then I ended up back at Hopkins. running their high-performance computing lab. I did that for about a year, a little less than a year, and then I ended up taking a job locally right around the corner here in AdTran as a CIO, and I also wear the hat as a CISO there. So obviously I got here in November. I've got security challenges I got to deal with, so I'm in this whole transformation experience again, so this is why the topic. So gives you a little background to put things in perspective. Everybody's got, sometimes you get speakers who will just start talking and you're like, hey, where do your perspectives come from? So I thought I'd lay that out a little bit. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. All right, so I talked a little bit about where I came from. In the old days, security was there. In 1989, I read that book, and that's when I became hooked on security, right? Anybody who knows the history of cyber knows Clifford Stoll's book, and that's when I became hooked on information security. And if you haven't read that book, if some of the newer folks who to this space, you might want to go back and read that. It's a pretty easy read. You can do it in probably a couple hours. All right, so let's talk about what are the key components of information security program. So when you're setting up a program, there's some key tenets and key things that you need to have in place in order to have a successful program. Obviously, commitment from the top of the organization. That's critical that you have that commitment. Having a security team or having the ability to form a security team, because you may inherit an organization that doesn't have this. They may have people that are wearing the hat of security, but they really don't understand security. So you have to do some kind of assessment when you go into an organization to figure out what kind of competency do these folks have. Can you give them additional training to get them up to speed? And that obviously is critical. So policy framework, some kind of policy framework to really drive what you're trying to accomplish. Because you have to always end up coming back and driving everything you do back to the policy, which should align with your business strategy as well. You don't just do policy just for the sake of doing policy. It should be, we're an ISO shop. We do that because we need certifications to do business with in different areas. We're also a publicly traded company, so we've got other requirements. And in past organization, when I was at Hopkins, we were a risk management framework shop, so we had RMF as our framework. So you have to have some kind of a framework. Continuous monitoring is critical today. Awareness program, we'll talk a little bit more about some of this stuff later. And a strategy for how you're going to implement security and how you're going to mature it over time. And that includes having a roadmap. And a security roadmap is not like your traditional IT roadmap, which would be 3 to 5 years. A security roadmap should be short, 1 year, maybe 18 months at the max, because things are changing so fast in this space that you can't really live off of a 3 or 4 year roadmap for security. You really have to be more aggressive about how you manage security and making sure that you're constantly looking at and reassessing the tool set you have and how well it's working and how it's being used in an organization. And then obviously metrics are a big component of that as well. So my whole position is I wear 2 hats. I wear the CIO hat, so I'm responsible for IT for the organization, and I also wear the CISO hat. And a lot of folks, I don't know how many folks in the room also are in that same camp, but you have this balancing thing that you got to do, right? And I believe security is an enabler, and I always try to treat, when I see a problem that's centered around security, we try to jump on it as fast as possible before it festers and it becomes a problem, and you start getting rumor mill about different ways to attack the problem, or the users go out and figure out an alternative approach to solving that problem. So it's always in your best interest to jump on those challenges and figure out how can we help you do this securely, right? Versus waiting for the users to figure out how to do it the wrong way, then you have to retrofit an environment. So your traditional attack methodology and roadmap, I mean, you have your reconnaissance that occurs. You've got your scanning for obviously figuring out, hey, once we identify you as a potential target, then we'll scan your environment and say, hey, what are some openings that we could potentially exploit? And then you got the various techniques that will be used, social engineering, looking at your web applications, et cetera. And then once they get in, there's an escalation of privileges. And then the next step is sustainment. Hackers, most of the threats that we're seeing, folks are after information. They want information. If you think of an organization like AdTran, we've got a lot of patents around some of the products that we produce. We got competition out there on the other side of the water. They're interested in that. They want to give their companies a competitive advantage. And obviously, when I was at Hopkins and at IDA, there was the nation states that were constantly hitting us, trying to get access to that information, that research. Those think tanks are big targets for exploitation. Then the last piece is obviously exfiltrating the data and then covering their tracks. They don't want to be discovered. They just want to get in and get their data and never let you know they were there. We'll get into some more stuff. So my whole tenet is, if you really focus on security alone, you're never going to achieve the objective you want. You're never going to get to that point where you feel really comfortable. It has to be a combination of really managing IT better and putting in good hygiene, and it starts with some of the basics. And we're going to get to some of those foundational levels, and I'll walk you through that here in a second. So this is an example of some of the data breach. So a lot of companies think that, hey, it's only the big companies that are getting targeted. Look, 61% of companies that have been breached have 1,000 employees or less. Another interesting thing, 95% of the breaches are caused by human error. So that means that either somebody in IT as an admin or some user did something, and those are the things that we really have to try to figure out how to prevent those activities from occurring in the first place. And then this is really interesting. 197 days is the average to detect a breach. That means that they're in your environment for that period of time on average before they're even detected. So there's a lot of things that could occur inside your environment in almost 200 days, and that's the average. So I'll show you some other examples that go even deeper than that. So this is one from one of the websites that tracks all the major breaches, and we're going to focus a little bit on this Marriott thing. So Marriott bought Starwood hotels. They were breached in 2014. Marriott acquired them in 2016. The breach wasn't detected until 2018. So it was 4 years of reservation records that were compromised. I mean, just think about that. 4 years. That's a long time for someone to be in your environment. And I know Marriott headquarters is up in Bethesda, Maryland. I used to go to a lot of conferences and run into those folks all the time. They spend a lot of money on security. A lot of money. They got a big IT team. They got a big security team. But 2 years after acquiring a merger, you have these best practices for how you should merge and how you should vet your potential customers you're going to merge in your environment. It took them 2 years before they figured out what the hell was going on. Excuse my language. All right. So your traditional kind of phishing attack puts you in this scenario. You got an attack that occurs, and hey, you don't know really where it's coming from, right? So this is the typical thing you see in an environment. The first thing you want to look at from a challenge perspective is, obviously, you want to know when was the attack detected. And from a metric perspective, you want to be able to track, as you go through your incidents, how long did it take us to detect that? So we can look at that average. Are we 197 days before we detect, or are we in a different time window? The other piece is you want to know if it propagated across your environment. Did it go to other systems? And this was the problem that happened at Hopkins, because they were finding these things, but they were doing the whack-a-mole thing. They were dealing them as a case-by-case basis and isolating it and writing beautiful reports that outlined everything they did for each one of those individual systems, but at the same time, it had just propagated across the environment laterally. Right? And then what remediation level is required? And then you want to know, hey, what was compromised, and was there data exfiltration? Did data actually leave our environment? And then the key thing is who's got to be notified, right? And depending on if you're a publicly traded company, if you have cyber insurance, these have financial impacts to your organization when these things occur. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about that piece. So this illustration really kind of depicts this whole piece. So if you look at when an incident occurs, that detection period, and you can think of it and say, hey, if we detect it in minutes and hours, maybe we should be considered green. And then if it takes us days and weeks, that's yellow, and then, hey, months or years, we're red. But if you really think about that statistic we saw earlier, if you could detect within weeks, you're probably green, right? You're probably doing pretty well if you can figure out in weeks. Obviously, no one wants to think of that and say, you know what, I got to talk to my board, I got to tell them that they were there for weeks before we detected them. But if you look at the average on that 197 days, that's actually not too bad. But in reality, you really want to try to do it as soon as possible. And then after that, and that just ties back to that example, there's a communication piece, and then you have to figure out how to close that window. So everybody's going to deal with these things. We're going to have the window open at some point. And really the test of your organization is how fast, once you do detect something, you can close that window. How good is your team? What kind of tools? Do you have the right kind of technology in place to help you mitigate that risk and quickly close that window and shut that attempt off, right, from exfiltrating the data? And obviously, the kinds of capabilities you need to have in place to do that, centered around having visibility of your infrastructure, what kind of detection technology footprint do you have a SOC monitoring from the outside? Are you doing it yourself? Do you have your own internal SOC? Are you monitoring 24/7? Do your people have the due diligence to do that, or should you pay for a managed service company to provide that for you? And I'm a big believer that you should leave that to managed services, to organizations that do that as a full-time basis, depending on how big you are as an organization. And this is more for a commercial side. And then obviously you have a damage assessment period afterwards. Hey, what really happened? What's the impact? How does that affect my environment? So another piece is you need to understand your environment from a data exploitation, but you need to know when you think something's happening in your environment, right? So if you don't know what's normal, right, from a data flow perspective, and you haven't mapped that out in your head, and you can't say to we typically have about 18 terabytes leaving our organization on a daily basis or a monthly basis or whatever the size of your environment is. And this is pretty normal, and we plot this and monitor and watch this. So if we see spikes that are outside of the normal, then you need to know where your spikes are too, because you may have some activities that occur. We may have a backup that's going off site that may spike. You may have international locations. They may be pulling data over in the middle of the night. But you need to understand your footprint from a standpoint of the data flow and really track that, because that's going to give you a good indication of what's going on in your environment when something suspicious is actually occurring and data is leaving your environment. The other piece is you need to be able to tell what's coming in as well, right? So you need to have the kind of technology in place that'll help you determine what's coming in and what's leaving, and being able to break down all the encryption to be able to look pure inside of that to see whether there's actually obfuscated traffic inside of those payloads. All right, so this is really critical here. So a lot of organizations go out and say, hey, we've got great security, we've got all the greatest tools, we've got the sophisticated capability, but they don't understand where their assets are. They have zero. So the confidence you have in your IT security, right, should be no greater than the confidence you have in your ability to your configuration management. So if you don't know what assets are in your environment, you're just fooling yourselves, right? So if you don't know this life cycle and you're not managing to this life cycle, and you understand when new things get introduced to your environment that you intentionally introduced to your environment, and you're managing to that, you're really just fooling yourselves with regards to security. You can put all the greatest security tools in the world, but if you only understand 70, 80%, and you got 20% you don't know about, those are the areas where you're going to be potentially compromised. And this really goes back to CIS controls 1 and 2, right? So those are sort of foundational things, and that's why they're number 1 and 2. Understand your assets, what you're managing, track them, monitoring through their entire life cycle, not just at one point in time, but continuously monitor them so you always know where they're at. And then the other part is understand your applications and your software that's in your environment, and monitor that, track that, and know why it's there, right? If you don't know why the software is there, then you should be challenging it, right? But not to a point where you're getting into confrontations with your user community. The other thing is you need to look at your partners. There's lots of tools out there today that actually give you a score on how well your partners are doing from the outside in. They'll take a look at every environment. There's BitSight, there's UpGuard, and Scorecard. Scorecard is actually will let you do it at no cost. You can go in and look and just sign up for a free account, and you can get some visibility into what their database isn't as deep as BitSight is with regards to the number of clients they have, but it's a nice little tool. You can get a quick look at some of your major partners, and then when you're dealing with them with contracts and you're renegotiating, you could use this as leverage to say, hey, look, your score is a D from a security perspective. You guys either fix that or we need to renegotiate our rates, right? A lot of that stuff is being written into a lot of the contracts now to make sure that, hey, if you don't maintain a C or a B or better, then we're not going to do business with you, right? And that's a way to hold your partners, suppliers accountable. So another challenge, and this was one of the things that happened when I went to Hopkins. So when I got to Hopkins, they had probably 60 or 70 different security platforms to include some homegrown tools that were really sophisticated. But everything was working in a silo. They didn't mature any of the technology. So if you look at this, And they had, from a market position, they had all the latest, greatest products they could have, right? But from a maturity perspective internally, they never got beyond like a 1 or 2 in any one area because they were so busy just trying to turn the tools on and keep them running that they couldn't ever get the value out of the tool. And so less is more, right? From a standpoint of if you need some critical tools in place, some foundational pieces, and you need to make sure that they're orchestrated in a way that they're going to work together. And you don't need to kill yourself trying to manage more platforms than your team can handle, right? And that really ties back into a whole governance piece. You need to have some governance around your decision on which tools you're going to put in place, and you have to explain what the rationale, how does it fit into your overall strategy and scheme. So if you look at the building blocks of security, so at the core level, these are some of the foundational things that most organizations should have from a base level capability with regards to security capabilities, right? You should have, obviously antivirus firewalls, asset management, patch management, acceptable use policy. These are, and then as you mature, add in additional capabilities, and you might have a sprinkling of some of these things and some of the lower things, and then you'll have higher level capabilities. But, and this is just an example, it's not sort of a recipe to say follow this track, but it gives you an example. If you look at and you plot across your organization and you took this and say, hey, how many of these things do we have and where do they fit? Do we have all the stuff at the top and we don't have any of the stuff at the bottom? And if you have that, then you're building your foundation you're building on a foundation that's ultimately going to prove out to fail, right? Because if you don't have the ability, you don't know your assets, and you're buying all these sophisticated tools, you're just fooling yourself. You need to solve those core IT problems and before you start adding all this sophisticated capability. And once you do add that tool set, then you need to organize it in a way so that it makes sense and you can explain it to your board and to other parts of your organization of why we have these tools in place. So you have different layers from an information protection layer, so and then your internet layer, your boundary layer, and then your internet and cloud layer, right? Different tools that are going to help protect your environment. And there's some logic behind how that's organized. And then that information should feed into some kind of a SIEM environment or an aggregator to be able to collect that information. And then that should, obviously, the needles in the, that you find should raise up to a level where they end up going to your service desk to be able to deal with potential issues that you may need to resolve. So this is a way of kind of organizing how you think about your stack of security and how it works inside of your environment. All right, and then there's always this piece to deal with, right? The number one problem in security, right, is the human OS, right? Biggest problem we all have, and it'll continue to be that, right? And security awareness hasn't prevented that, right? You hear all the stories. Hey, we do security awareness. We come in and do the testing. We send the phishing campaigns out, and everybody still get 90% click rate, right? No matter how much awareness we do. And they do annual training. We do quarterly training, but they will still click those things. So you need to think about security where you don't give them the opportunity to opt out. For example, a lot of folks will do patch management, and they'll give the users the opportunity to just opt out, right? And if you give them the opportunity to opt out, users will opt out, right? So you got to figure out ways to, if you're going to let them opt out for some period of time, but make it mandatory that, hey, you can opt out for a day or two, but ultimately you get one chance to opt out, but that's not going to last but for a short period of time. The other piece is, as I talked about earlier, you need to work with your users when they have a challenge, because if you don't, they're going to figure out how to get around you, right? And we all have experienced this where they've gone out and you told them, you didn't give them an answer, you didn't get back to them soon enough, so they figured out a way to get to it and do it their own way. And you don't know what they did to do that and what additional holes they put in your environment. And you're going back and you got to retrofit this, right? And that's the worst thing you can do is have to go back to the user and tell them, hey, we're going to stop you from doing something, and then we're going to try to give you a better way. That better way is never acceptable to the user community. But if you get to them before they do that, and you have that conversation early on, and you say, hey, look, I know you want to get to these tool sets. Here's a way we can get you to that tool set, and it adds security, and you can explain to them as you go through that process. All right. This is an example of what I try to put in place when I go to an organization from a governance process. And I'm just going to let this build out and I'll talk you through it. All right, so within IT, every service you have has a life cycle associated with it, right? So no matter what it is, whether you buy hardware, assets, or software, it has a life cycle associated with it, and you should be managing to that life. Should be part of your portfolio, right? You have IT service management has a framework that's used for your IT to provide that service and manage that service. Business has a corresponding role in providing you the requirements, and they're the users of those services. Each one of those produce metrics. You get metrics from the business of how well those tools are working, and you get metrics from the service desk on the performance of those capabilities. At the same time, you have your governance process where you're meeting with your executive team, talking to them about new requirements, what's the business doing and how can we help you meet your requirements, right? It should be that way versus, hey, here's what we got, tell us how we fit it in. It should be the other way. Hey, here's what we're going as a business. Okay, how do you help us get there better with this model? And then you have to have some kind of a tech steering committee that should be evaluating and looking at how you converge that business requirement and IT where you come to some agreement. PMO capability, and some organizations may have a full PMO. I usually try to do a light PMO for the IT side of the house to make sure that we have participation from both the business and IT and that arrangement, and then it goes back into the whole life cycle again. So this is a continuous life cycle for how I try to organize the companies that I've worked for and that I've supported around this methodology. So when you don't do these things, you end up in an environment like this where you have a distribution of workload that is heavily centered around keeping the lights on, right? You're just so busy. You got so many security tools, you can never get any of them optimized. So you got all kinds of holes in your environment. And so data is leaking out of your environment on a full-time basis. So you really need to focus on how do you distribute that workload a little bit better. And if you don't, you're going to end up with multiple windows open, which will end up here. You know, we won't be around too much longer, right? That distribution should be more along the lines of this, where you have a 40-30-30 kind of split, where you have maintenance, enhancement, and innovation. There should be a little bit of all that going on from an operational IT perspective to have a more balanced workload. I know I've done a lot of talking. Any questions, any feedback? Anybody in the room? No? Yeah.
When you were at John Hopkins, for example, you're dealing with, like I said, intelligent people. They have sort of an academic mindset in a lot of ways.
Right.
From a cultural standpoint, did you find like they were behind some initiatives, or did you have to take time and effort, or how did you engage people?
You know, it's funny because culture is really probably the biggest challenge you have, and all of us have as IT and security practitioners, is dealing with how do you first, when you're new to an environment, how do you get them on board, right? And then the other piece is you almost have to figure out how you can prove it to them without doing it in a negative sense, right? You gotta demonstrate where the problems are. And at Hopkins, there were a lot of smart people who knew all the right things, but they still wanted to do things their way, right? And like I said, I was there for 9 months, and until we actually showed them, because we had guys who left who left RAND and who were followed from RAND, came to Hopkins, and this is just to give you an idea about the mentality. I had an argument with one of the guys who ran the data center, and I wanted to put in revamp the whole DNS capability because we were at that point we were publicly we had a Class B, and we were publicly advertising all the IP addresses. So if you were a researcher who just came into the organization, you could just follow that guy across, as he traversed the internet back into the environment. And I had a debate with the data center guy. I said, hey, well, you know, DNS is a problem. We need to fix this. And he says, well, I don't understand why we want to do this project. What's DNS have to do with security? And so that kind of gives you an idea. People get set in their ways. And then once folks got educated and we went through the incident, it was everybody did a 180, and it was a whole different environment. But it had to, you know, unfortunately, it had to get to that point. But that was actually a good thing for the lab, because what happened after that is the lab collaborated with NSA. Now they have a cyber think tank and they have a deeper relationship with NSA, and now they're like the leaders in cybersecurity, right? So it went from being this, hey, we're just like a college, we want to keep this low-key, casual environment, we don't have Big Brother, we want everybody to do their own thing, to now they're really heavily focused on security, and you walk into that place, because I left and I came back, 10 years later, whole different. The same guy that I was talking to was citing regulations and RMF frameworks, and I was like, whoa, is this the same guy? So it can happen. It's just, unfortunately, sometimes you have to prove out to them for it to happen. And the other way is, I think, if you have conversations about, stuff, real world examples, like industries, and talk about those real examples, and then do your awareness to different levels of the organization. So, you want to talk to your managers and try to get your managers on board. So when things come down and people start complaining, like things start trickling up, and the next thing you know, like, hey, gets all the way back up to the senior level again, like, hey, can we stop that? Because that's causing problems over here. I mean, everybody knows that end around that happens when you try to implement something new, is to make sure that those folks are on board before you start this. So when those questions come up from the ranks of the organization, that they're already prepared for it. They understand why we're doing it, and it's tied back to the business. So if you go back to that governance piece, if you're doing that governance and you're talking to the leadership about why we're doing this and it's aligned with your business strategy, then there's no surprises, right? Everybody knows what's going on. The worst you can do is roll out a new thing and have the users like, hey, where did this come from? Why are we doing this? They should know way in advance that, hey, we're rolling out a new tool. We're going to be putting this out there. You guys, here's what the impact will be. It'll start here, and we'll gradually, move through the organization. So, any other questions on that? All right. So, all right. So, just to kind of summarize here, establish and maintain visibility. You got to know your assets, your network, your data flow. Data flow is critical. I mean, it's just like, hey, what's going on in your network at 2 o'clock in the morning? Do you know what's happening between 2 and 6? What kind of data is leaving your organization at time? Obviously, that time is aligned with another part of the world. Do you know what's happening on your network? And do you have data just flowing out of your organization at that time, and no one's there because no one's watching, right? Your business, hey, you got to know your business, because the security that's right for AdTrend is not right for APL. And APL security won't work at AdTrend, right? There are some things you can carry over. Like, I'll give you a great example. During doing RMF, I don't know how many folks are familiar with the risk management framework and stigging, the whole stigging process. So we decided, hey, we're going to leverage that capability, and we're going to use the Category 1 to do all of our Linux environment. We're going to do Category 1, apply the Category 1s from the DISA stigs on all of our Linux environment. And we figured, well, that'll be a baseline, and that's an authorized baseline that's already been vetted. I don't have to worry about whether my guys knew from a security perspective how to pick the right things. We can just apply that base level. And for Hopkins, that's not good enough, because you got to do up to level 3. But for a commercial company, those Category 1s, for the most part, will work well in most environments. And you still got to do your testing to make sure you're not breaking anything. But you can use that as a way to say, hey, at a minimum, we're leveraging, and that's publicly accessible for anybody. You can go to their site, get access to those to the security settings. And a STIG basically is it's for Windows, for every platform, just describes a set of security settings that you should apply. And it'll give you a recommendation on how to harden your environment. And it'll give you, like, Category 1s are sort of the basic things that you should have, and then you build, as you get more secure, you go up to Category 2 and then 3. And this makes your system a little bit more hardened from that perspective. But you can use that as a methodology to say, hey, look, this is already vetted by them. They send out updates on a quarterly basis, so they're reviewing them on a quarterly basis. It's a way for you to apply a base level of security, and you can start with a hardened system before you even deploy it. You still got to make sure that it doesn't break anything that's critical to your environment, but that's just one example. All right, less is more when it comes to some of the tools. You don't want to inundate yourself with so many tools you can't manage them. If you can't manage them, then what good are they to you, right? You really need to have a proportionate amount of capability that your team can actually manage, and you can optimize the performance of that tool, right? Because what good is it to have something you just turn on and it's just sitting there collecting data and you never get a chance to go back and look at it? I know there's environments where folks will have tools and they'll be sitting there for, no one's looked at it and logged in for years. It's just sitting there running, right? But you're spending money on it, it's costing you. costing you money, and you're not getting any value out of it. Trading for your team, right? So one of the things that I'm bringing into my environment now is I'm going to have all my admins go through Security Plus training. And I'm going to do that, and I'm doing that now because make this assumption that everybody can pick up security, that they're natively going to learn it. You can just give them one of these briefings and boom, they're going to know it. You really need to start and give them the foundational things so they understand, well, when they're building a system, how to do it securely and why it's important for them to do that. So we're going to start with making sure that all of our admins go through Security Plus training, and it's our investment in them. And I incentivize the folks by saying, hey, look, from a career perspective, it's not going to hurt you to have additional security on your resume. So this is a good thing for you. You should go through this process because it's going to make you more valuable. It'll help you enhance your career. Plus, it'll give you a better understanding of what we're trying to accomplish as an organization from a security perspective.
Raymond,
Yeah.
how low do you go for the Security Plus training? Like, so do you do that down to the desktop support team, or do you do it like for the server admins, network admins, and all?
I'm doing it from the basic level, from my desktop guys and help desk support team all the way up to even my application programmers. I want them to go through that because that's the beginning. The next stage is, okay, now I need to get them application training on how to develop code securely, right? But I want everybody to have the right foundation so they know why.
I totally agree with that. I just wonder how far down I should put it.
And what I'm trying to do, so what my first pass at doing this internally, I've only been there for 8 months, was we took some training dollars and I had a couple of guys go off to class and a couple guys do the self-paced. Self-paced thing doesn't work out as well because people get busy, they go home, and they don't really focus. They really need that classroom setting. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring in an instructor. I'm going to do a half day, 2 half-day sessions, and I'll have 2 groups go a half day so I can still run my business and run the IT part of it, and I'll have them go to different sessions. But I'm going to have them sit in a classroom so they can talk to an instructor and ask questions because I can't just depend on them to do it on their own time and do it as an online thing. It's just, and I can't send everybody away to remotely to a class. So I want to bring in an instructor and do it as a classing. And then I'm going to offer this up to my engineering side of the house as well so that they can participate as well and then kind of build on that. All right. So obviously building an operational strategy on how you're going to integrate your tools and how they're going to work together, how your people are going to work together. You saw that slide where I showed you the different layers of defense and how they all interoperate together and how they're tied back to the SIM. That should be a strategy that every organization should have some similar kind of, not necessarily in that same format, but that's just an example of how all that stuff should be orchestrated so it works together, right? You don't want your tools just off on silos, not talking to each other, not complementing each other. And then when you have an incident, you want to be able to look at everything holistically, and you may have to go to the individual tools as well to validate things, but you want to have a holistic view of your environment. Continuous monitoring is essential. I mean, you got to monitor all the time, and you got to track that, and you got to look at that data. You got to go to the security meetings and actually review the data, look at those critical metrics, and don't just look at the metrics that are meaningless. You really need to look at that and try to track things like, hey, when we have an incident, how long did it take us, and how can we get better each time? How long did it take us to remediate that? Why did it take us 5 hours? Can we do that faster? Or what are we doing wrong? What are we missing? And then you can't make assumptions that people are doing things right. You may have to sit in and kind of review, because I made the assumption that everybody who runs an Exchange environment knows how to go in and use tools to go out and extract email out of the environment, because that's a common practice that we use on the DoD side of the house is being able to go in and extract emails that may have if you have a different kind of incidents that occur. And I made that assumption of my Exchange administrators that when I came to my environment, we had a phishing incident that email got spammed around to the environment, and I just assumed that everyone knew how to do this. And I went back and said, well, what are you guys doing? I said, oh, we're doing this. I'm like, you guys don't know how to use the expurge tool capability to go in and pick the, no. So it's just, you got to make sure you validate, and especially if you're going into a new environment and you don't know your people. Validate that. All right. Be proactive. Make security. Be an enabler for security. Right. You want to go and, like I said, get to your users, find out what their needs are, figure out how to do it with them, and work with them, and do this in a secure way versus letting them go off and figure it out on their own, and then having to tell you after the fact, and you have to say, you can't really do it that way. That's going to cause a problem. All right, so your existing tools, we talked about this. Managed services, there's opportunities out there to leverage managed services from a monitoring perspective. I think that, to me, that's really a real good use of managed service from a security perspective. Having someone else look at your environment and then watch your environment on top of you guys. So when you guys go home at night, somebody's watching, they're giving you a report. They know how to get in touch with you if something goes wrong in the middle of the night, but you have somebody watching your environment. And as a commercial environment, I say this is really a best practice that you really should have somebody looking at your environment. And then, last but not least, governance. Have some kind of governance process. Figure out, if you don't have that in place, talk to your leadership, talk to your CIO, your CEO, make sure that they understand, you understand what the business is planning so that you can adjust your security to meet the business needs, right? It shouldn't be the other way around. You shouldn't put security in and then say business adjust around the security. Here's what the business needs to do. We're going to figure out how to do it securely, and we're going to adjust our plan around the business. It shouldn't be the opposite way. And you always run into fights if you say, hey, you can't do that because we're going to violate. I mean, you just end up in those battles that you're never going to win. So you really want to get ahead of it by saying, hey, let's understand what we're going to be doing as a business, what changes are happening. Mergers, for example, you look at that merger that Marriott had, right? Obviously, there was a lot of things missed when they acquired that company. So you want to get ahead of these things. What's being planned? We're going to acquire anybody? Do we need to be concerned about it? Do we need to prepare for that? All right. Questions? Oh, I'm right on time. So thoughts, questions? This is just, like I said, I've been in IT security for almost 30 years, a long time. And these are things that I've used across those organizations I showed you I've been at, and they've worked for me. Knock on wood. but because you never know. I mean, hey, there's no absolutes in security, right? Any questions, feedback, comments? Was this helpful or? All right. All right, thanks everyone.